The cutting wind of Toronto pierced through the glass windows of the luxurious skyscraper that housed the headquarters of Lancaster Tech inside. The world revolved around a single man. Victor Lancaster, a tech magnate, an unrelenting visionary, a name that evoked both respect and fear. He had not built his empire with kindness. His trademark was brutal efficiency. The conference room was full, yet silence reigned. A young executive had just presented a new project, waiting anxiously for a sign of approval. Victor leaned back in his leather chair, drummed his fingers on the glass table, and without altering his tone, delivered his verdict. "Mediocrity. Is that all you have to offer me?" The man swallowed hard. Everyone knew that a comment like that, coming from Victor, was the equivalent of professional exile. The magnate stood up and slowly walked toward the panoramic window, from where he could see the city pulsing below him, a swarm of ordinary people living ordinary lives. He despised mediocrity. In the corner of the room, Emma Carter, his personal secretary, observed everything in silence. She had seen this scene play out many times before. Victor destroyed careers as effortlessly as he signed million-dollar contracts. Emma was intelligent, brilliant even, but she worked for Victor because she knew that surviving in this environment required more than talent. It required resilience. She was the only one who could endure his arrogance and his obsessive need for control. Still, to him, she was just another piece on the chessboard, someone he underestimated, disregarded, and often humiliated. "Emma, coffee. And for God's sake, don't forget the exact amount of sugar I've explained to you a million times." She didn't respond. She simply left the room with the same impassive elegance as always. But inside she felt a deep contempt. Victor Lancaster was brilliant but blind. He saw numbers, strategies, profit projections, but he didn't see people. He failed to realize that his empire was upheld by those he treated as disposable. Richard Hall, Victor's business partner and friend since university, entered the room shortly after. Unlike Victor, Richard knew how to use charm and diplomacy when necessary. "You should take it easy, Vic. One day, someone might get tired of this and actually try to hurt you, maybe even stage an attack. Seriously, you never know." Victor laughed, a short, humorless chuckle. "People don't get tired of power, Richard. They'll endure anything for a piece of it." Richard smiled, but there was something different in his eyes. A gleam that Victor, blind in his arrogance, failed to notice. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, painting the city white, a silent omen of what was to come. The truck's engine roared as Victor and Richard drove down a deserted road, cutting through the endless white expanse of the Canadian wilderness. Heavy snow fell, reducing visibility, but Victor didn't care. He trusted technology. The GPS would guide them to the cabin where they would spend the night before their meeting with investors the next day. "I don't know why you insist on these trips, Richard. All of this could be handled over a video call." Richard smiled, with the patience of someone who knew how to play the long game. "Not everything can be done remotely, Vic. Some things need to be discussed face to face." Victor scoffed, turning his gaze to the monochromatic landscape. He didn't like the idea of leaving his natural habitat, the skyscraper where his presence was law. But he trusted Richard. If his partner said this meeting was important, then it was worth it. The narrow road twisted through ice-covered trees. The radio crackled, picking up a distant transmission about an intensifying storm. Richard drove calmly, his expression serene. He was always like that. Patient, friendly, the perfect counterbalance to Victor's sharp-edged temperament. They arrived at the cabin at dusk. The place was rustic but comfortable. Victor dropped his suitcase on the couch and walked toward the makeshift bar. "Whiskey?" he asked, pouring himself a glass before even waiting for an answer. Richard accepted a glass but drank slowly. Victor took a long sip, feeling the warmth of the liquor burn down his throat. "You know, Vic," Richard began, his tone almost casual, "have you ever stopped to think about how many enemies you have?" Victor let out a dry chuckle. "Is that a compliment? Just an observation? Do you really think people tolerate you because they admire you?" They put up with you because they have to. But the moment they don't need you anymore, well, let's just say the world can be dangerous for a man like you. Victor raised an eyebrow. And you? Why do you put up with me? Richard smiled. A smile that was difficult to decipher. Because I need you. The words hung in the air, carrying a subtle weight. Victor felt an inexplicable unease. But before he could respond, a loud knock at the door shattered the silence. They exchanged glances. Who could be there in the middle of nowhere during a storm? Victor walked to the door and opened it. And then everything went dark. A searing pain exploded in his head. His body was thrown backward, the whiskey glass shattering on the floor. He tried to react, but his senses were numb, his vision blurred. Someone was holding him, dragging him outside into the merciless cold. The ice bit into his skin like sharp fangs. His body was tossed into the snow. The wind howled around him. He tried to move, but his limbs felt like lead. His mind screamed questions. Ooh, why? And then, the last thing he saw before total darkness was a shadowy figure walking away, leaving him to die. The darkness was thick, almost tangible. Victor felt his body sinking into the ice as if he were being devoured by something unseen. He tried to move, but it was as if his muscles had been stolen from him. With each breath, the cold sliced into his lungs like sharp blades. His consciousness flickered in and out. Snow fell onto his face, forming a white shroud. Time passed in an abstract way, minutes, hours. He didn't know. Then came the pain. A dull, throbbing ache at the back of his head, reminding him of the blow he had taken. He tried to recall who had been behind the door, but his mind was a storm of fragmented images. The only certainty was that someone wanted him dead. And Richard? Where was Richard? The snow piled on his chest, and hypothermia began to set in. His body trembled uncontrollably, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the shaking stopped. After that, sleep would come, and then the end. But before that, his mind forced him to one last thought. He had treated her as nothing. Disposable piece. For years, he had unloaded his frustration, his contempt, his impatience onto her. And yet, she was the only person in the company who truly knew his schedule. If anyone would notice his absence, if anyone would suspect something was wrong, it would be her. A faint chuckle escaped his lips. The icy air burned his throat. It would be poetic, in a way, if she were the one to uncover everything. If he was still alive to see it happen. The darkness returned, this time stronger. And Victor stopped feeling the cold. Emma Carter closed her laptop with a heavy sigh. Something was wrong. Victor Lancaster wasn't the kind of man who disappeared without a trace. Yes, he was unpredictable, ruthless, and insufferable, but never irresponsible with his business. If there was an important meeting, he would be there, ready to humiliate anyone who wasn't prepared. But that day he didn't show up. He didn't answer messages. No sign of life. Her instincts told her there was more behind his disappearance. With swift fingers, she accessed the company's internal system and found Victor's itinerary. A trip to a remote cabin with Richard Hall. The information made her pause. Richard had always seemed like the more reasonable of the two. Cordial, well-connected, the opposite of Victor's aggressive temperament. But there had always been something about him she never fully trusted. And then, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Before leaving, Victor had given her a document, a detailed report on suspicious financial transactions within the company. Transactions signed by Richard. A chill ran down Emma's spine. If Victor had confronted Richard about it, things could have escalated quickly. The storm battered the road as Emma finally arrived at the location marked on the GPS. The cabin was dark, silent. No signs of life. Her heart pounded. She stepped out of the car, feeling the icy wind cut into her skin like blades. Walking up to the door, she pushed it open. It was unlocked. Inside, everything was pristine. No signs of struggle, nothing out of place. Just 2 empty glasses on the table and a faint scent of whiskey in the air. But no Victor. Emma stepped back outside, shielding her eyes from the dense snowfall. And then she saw it. Footprints, leading from the cabin door into the forest, but not returning. Her chest tightened. She followed the tracks with careful steps, sinking into the snow up to her knees. The cold was unbearable. And then, in the blue-tinged shadows of the night, she saw him. A figure collapsed in the snow. Motionless. Victor. She cried out, running toward him. He was as pale as the landscape around him. His lips were blue, his half-closed eyes covered by a thin layer of frost. Emma knelt beside him, feeling panic grip her throat. "You're not going to die here. Not like this. Not now." She cupped his face in her hands and saw his eyelids twitch. He was still there. Barely. With all her strength, she lifted him, dragging him toward the car. His body was heavy, and every step was a battle against the snow and wind. But Emma Carter didn't give up easily. Not when there was something to be done. And this time, saving Victor Lancaster was a reckoning with fate. Without a second thought, she grabbed her car keys and rushed out of the building. Victor Lancaster woke up feeling a warmth he hadn't known in a long time. It wasn't comforting. It was searing, as if his body were forcing itself back to life. He blinked a few times, the dim hospital room light filtering into his blurry vision. He was alive. Welcome back to the land of the living. The voice was unmistakable. He turned his head and found Emma Carter sitting beside his bed, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Emma didn't look emotional or worried, just exhausted. "How?" His voice came out hoarse, a broken whisper. "You owe your life to 2 things. My instincts and my infinite patience with your demands." Victor almost smiled. Almost. She had saved him. The woman he had underestimated, humiliated, and treated as disposable had risked her own life to pull him back from the edge of death. The weight of that irony didn't escape him. Emma stood up, grabbed a glass of water, and handed it to him without the slightest gentleness. "Drink. And listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. I know Richard tried to kill you. Looks like he had plans for the company and wanted you out of the way. Some other employees are with him on this." Victor held the glass but didn't drink. He just stared at Emma. She knew. "Is he here?" he asked. "He left yesterday. But not before trying to convince everyone that you wandered off drunk and got lost in the snow. A tragic accident. An unfortunate mistake." Victor clenched his jaw. Richard had always been smart. Smart enough to shape narratives and walk away unscathed. "But there's a problem with his plan," Emma continued, leaning in slightly. "Me." She reached into her bag, pulled out a flash drive, and placed it on the bedside table. Toll booth cameras. Suspicious transactions. And the best part, an audio recording. He wasn't careful enough. Victor felt something cold run down his spine. And this time it wasn't the frost. Emma straightened, grabbing her coat. "I've already sent everything to the authorities. Soon Richard will be too busy dealing with the police. As for you, well, maybe it's time to reevaluate a few things." She turned to leave but hesitated for a brief moment. "And Victor, don't think this changes anything between us. I saved you because it was the right thing to do. But that doesn't mean I've forgiven you. You were a cruel man." And with that, without waiting for a response, Emma Carter walked out the door, leaving Victor alone. This time the silence didn't feel so comfortable. He looked at the flash drive on the table, then at the window. Outside, the ice was beginning to thaw. For the first time in a long time, Victor Lancaster realized that he might not be at the top of the world. Perhaps he was only just beginning to learn what survival truly meant. Victor Lancaster's chair remained empty. For weeks, the halls of Lancaster Tech were filled with whispers and wary glances. No one knew where he was. No bank transactions, no calls, no appearances. It was as if he had been swallowed by his own silence. The empire he built still stood, but for the first time it was without its king. Emma Carter felt the weight of his absence. She hated to admit it, but every morning she still half expected to hear his sharp voice ordering coffee, demanding reports, making her life hell. But now, all that remained was emptiness. And perhaps guilt. He had survived. But had he truly lived after that night in the snow? Emma knew something inside Victor had changed. She had seen it in the hospital, in his distant gaze. It wasn't fear nor weakness. It was a kind of belated realization. The look of a man who had finally understood the true cost of everything he had built. Then, one morning, everything changed. A plain brown envelope appeared on her desk, with no sender. No witnesses to say who had left it. Inside, just a single sheet of paper. A signature at the bottom. Victor Lancaster. And only one sentence. The empire is yours now. You are the CEO, the board has already approved. Emma read the words over and over, as if trying to decipher a hidden message. She looked at the empty chair, then at the gray city beyond the glass window. Victor Lancaster was alive. But somewhere in the world, he carried a burden that not even all the wealth he had amassed could erase. And Emma Carter, without ever asking for it, simply because of an act of kindness, was about to become the queen of a kingdom that, for years, had only brought her humiliation.
If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. We need your support.
Better stories are yet to come.